Before Miles Morales ever wore a mask, before the word Spider-Man became a burden and a promise intertwined with his name, his story unfolded quietly in Brooklyn, shaped not by destiny but by environment, family, and the subtle tension between who he was expected to be and who he felt himself becoming. A tension that defines his character long before the radioactive spider ever appears. Miles grows up in a loving but complex household, the son of Jefferson Davis, a principal police officer deeply committed to order, responsibility, and the belief that the world only works if people follow rules. And Rio Morales, a compassionate and emotionally intelligent nurse who understands that life is rarely so simple and that people, especially her son, need room to breathe, to explore, and to fail. And it is between these two parental forces that Miles's early identity forms, balanced delicately between structure and freedom, discipline and creativity, expectation and self-expression. A balance that he struggles to maintain even before his life takes a dramatic turn. Brooklyn itself is not merely a backdrop, but an active presence in Miles's upbringing, a living, breathing space filled with graffiti-covered walls, music drifting through open windows, conversations on stoops, subway rumble, and the constant sense of community that both nurtures and constrains him. And it is in this environment that Miles absorbs culture intuitively rather than academically, learning rhythm, color, language, and emotion not through formal lessons, but through lived experience, something that later manifests in his artistic talent and his deeply personal approach to heroism. Despite this vibrant setting, Miles often feels out of place, not because Brooklyn rejects him, but because he senses that he does not quite fit into the version of success being prepared for him, a feeling that crystallizes when he is accepted into Brooklyn Vision's Academy, an elite charter school designed to cultivate excellence, ambition, and intellectual rigor, a place his father sees as an opportunity and his mother celebrates as a triumph, while Miles himself experiences it as an unspoken test he is not sure he wants to pass. At Brooklyn Visions, Miles is surrounded by students who seem effortlessly confident, comfortable with competition and achievement, while he moves through the hallways with a quiet uncertainty, talented but unfocused, intelligent but disengaged, capable yet resistant to definition. And this internal dissonance becomes a central feature of his pre-Spider-Man life, as he navigates a world that continually tells him he should be more decisive, more disciplined, more driven, even as he struggles to articulate what he actually wants to be. His discomfort at the academy is not rooted in inability but in alienation, the sense that he is performing a role rather than inhabiting himself. And this feeling deepens his reliance on the one place where he feels entirely authentic, the abandoned subway tunnel where he goes to paint graffiti with his uncle Aaron, a space hidden from authority and expectation, where art becomes a language of freedom and connection rather than evaluation. Uncle Aaron represents a crucial influence in Miles' early life, not simply as a family member but as an emotional counterweight to Jefferson's rigidity, someone who listens without judgment, who encourages creativity, humor, and individuality, and who treats Miles not as a project to be shaped, but as a person to be understood. And it is through Aaron that Miles learns that identity can be fluid, expressive, and self-defined, even if this lesson exists in tension with Aaron's own secrecy and moral ambiguity. The relationship between Miles and Aaron is built on trust and shared experience, on music, jokes, and late-night conversations that allow Miles to feel seen in a way he rarely does elsewhere. And this bond becomes one of the most formative elements of his emotional world, laying the groundwork for both his strengths and his vulnerabilities, long before conflict enters the picture. Miles's relationship with his father, by contrast, is loving but strained, shaped by Jefferson's worldview as a police officer and his open distrust of Spider-Man, whom he sees as a reckless vigilante operating outside the law, a stance that Miles absorbs without fully understanding its implications, internalizing the idea that power without accountability is dangerous, even as he feels instinctively drawn to figures who challenge authority. And this ideological divide subtly positions Miles at the center of a conflict he does not yet realize he will one day embody. Jefferson's parenting is not harsh but firm, rooted in fear as much as principle. a fear of losing his son to a world that can be unjust and unforgiving. And while this fear motivates his protectiveness, it also creates emotional distance, leaving Miles unsure how to express his doubts, his anxieties, and his creative impulses without disappointing the man he loves and respects. Rio, meanwhile, acts as an emotional bridge within the family, offering reassurance without pressure, understanding without indulgence, and it is through her quiet encouragement that Miles begins to accept that uncertainty is not a flaw, but a stage, that not knowing who you are yet does not mean you are failing. A message that becomes essential later when his life demands choices far beyond anything he has prepared for. Before the spider bite, Miles's world is defined by this emotional landscape rather than by action, by conversations rather than confrontations, by internal struggle rather than external conflict. And this grounding in emotional realism is what ultimately distinguishes his story from that of the Spider-Men who come before him. Because Miles does not begin as someone yearning for greatness or adventure, but as someone simply trying to survive adolescence without losing himself. Even his intelligence, which is evident in moments of insight and curiosity, remains underdeveloped not due to lack of ability, but due to lack of direction. As though Miles is holding himself back out of fear that choosing one path will close off others forever. A fear common to adolescence but magnified by the expectations placed upon him by family, school, and society. This hesitation, this reluctance to commit fully to any one version of himself becomes a defining trait, and it is precisely this openness, this unfinished quality, that makes Miles uniquely suited to inherit the mantle of Spider-Man, even though he does not yet know it. The significance of Miles' early life lies not in foreshadowing his powers, but in establishing his humanity, his emotional intelligence, his capacity for empathy, and his deep connection to community. Because when the extraordinary finally enters his world, it does not overwrite who he is, but collides with it, forcing him to reconcile. Responsibility with authenticity, duty with individuality. Brooklyn teaches Miles that identity is layered and evolving, that you can belong to multiple worlds without fully conforming to any of them. And this lesson becomes foundational when the multiverse later demands that he define himself not just as a hero, but as a Spider-Man unlike any other. Long before destiny intervenes, Miles Morales is already navigating complexity, already balancing competing narratives about who he should be, and already searching for meaning in a world that does not offer simple answers. And it is this quiet, uncertain, deeply human beginning that makes everything that follows not just a story about superpowers, but a story about choice, growth, and the courage to become oneself in the face of overwhelming expectation. Miles Morales' first true encounter with Spider-Man is not the triumphant meeting of hero and successor that mythology might suggest, but a chaotic and frightening collision between an unprepared teenager and the brutal reality of what it actually means to carry the mask, because when Miles meets Peter Parker, it is in the aftermath of violence, in the shadow of danger, and under circumstances that immediately strip away any romantic notion of heroism. Peter Parker at this point is already an established symbol in Miles's world, a figure of admiration to the city, and a point of ideological conflict within his family, especially given Jefferson Davis' open disdain for Spider-Man as an outlaw vigilante. And yet, when Miles encounters him in person, Peter is not a distant icon, but a wounded man, exhausted, desperate, and fully aware that the stakes of the battle unfolding around them are far beyond what Miles can comprehend. This version of Peter Parker is experienced, confident and deeply burdened by responsibility, a hero who has long since learned to live with fear, loss, and sacrifice, and his interaction with Miles is shaped by urgency rather than warmth, as he immediately recognizes the boy's powers and understands the terrifying implication that someone else has been bitten by a spider from the Collider experiment. Peter's realization is not one of pride or excitement, but of dread, because he knows that Miles has been dragged into a war that will cost him innocence, safety, and potentially his life. And this awareness drives Peter's instinct to protect Miles, not by training him, but by keeping him away from the danger altogether. The brief mentorship that occurs between them is therefore fragmented and incomplete, defined by warnings rather than lessons, by attempts to send Miles home rather than prepare him for what lies ahead. And this incomplete transfer of knowledge becomes one of the most important emotional elements of Miles' story, because he does not inherit Spider-Man's role through careful guidance but through sudden loss. When Peter brings Miles to Aunt May's house, hoping to keep him safe while he deals with the Collider threat himself, the tone remains tense and unresolved, as Peter struggles with the guilt of knowing that Miles exists because of his own world's scientific hubris, and Miles struggles with a growing awareness that his powers are not a gift, but a responsibility he cannot simply reject. The dynamic between them is complicated by Miles's self-doubt, as he repeatedly insists that he is not like Peter, that he is not ready, that he cannot do what Spider-Man does, and Peter's responses, though well-intentioned, reinforce this insecurity by emphasizing caution over empowerment, reflecting Peter's own fear of repeating the cycle of loss by allowing another person to step into danger unprepared. Everything culminates in the confrontation at the Collider, where Peter Parker faces Kingpin's forces while Miles watches helplessly, bound and powerless, forced to witness the brutal reality of heroism without being able to intervene. And it is in this moment that Miles' understanding of Spider-Man shifts permanently, because the symbol he once saw from a distance is now embodied in a man who bleeds, struggles, and ultimately dies. Peter Parker's death is sudden, violent, and public, a seismic event that reverberates across the city and through Miles' psyche, because it is not merely the loss of a hero, but the loss of the one person who could have guided him through the chaos that now defines his life. For Miles, this death carries an unbearable weight of guilt, as he believes that his presence contributed to Peter's fate, that his weakness and fear played a role in the hero's sacrifice, and this guilt becomes a foundational element of his identity as Spider-Man, shaping his reluctance to embrace the role even as circumstances make retreat impossible. The city's response to Peter Parker's death further complicates Miles' emotional state, as public mourning transforms Spider-Man into a martyr, an untouchable ideal frozen in perfection, making the idea of replacing him feel not only impossible but disrespectful, as though stepping into the mask would be an act of betrayal rather than continuity. Jefferson Davis's reaction intensifies this conflict, as his grief over Spider-Man's death paradoxically softens his hostility toward the hero while deepening Miles's internal struggle, because Miles now carries a secret that prevents him from sharing in his father's mourning or explaining the complicated emotions he feels toward the fallen hero. Peter Parker's legacy, therefore, becomes both a burden and a compass for Miles, representing an unattainable standard of heroism while simultaneously providing a moral framework rooted in sacrifice, responsibility, and perseverance, values that Miles understands intellectually but does not yet believe he can embody. Unlike traditional mentor relationships, Peter does not live long enough to train Miles or validate his potential, leaving Miles to grapple with an inherited responsibility that feels incomplete and unfair, a legacy passed down not through consent but through circumstance. This absence shapes Miles' growth more powerfully than any prolonged mentorship could have, because it forces him to confront the question at the heart of Spider-Man's identity alone, without reassurance or instruction, asking not whether he can become Spider-Man, but whether he is willing to try despite knowing the cost. Peter Parker's death marks the end of Miles' life as a passive observer and the beginning of his transformation from frightened teenager to reluctant hero. Not because it inspires immediate courage, but because it removes the illusion that someone else will step in to save the day, leaving Miles with a choice that cannot be avoided. In inheriting Spider-Man's legacy through loss rather than triumph, Miles' story diverges sharply from heroic myth, grounding his journey in grief, guilt, and uncertainty, and establishing that his path forward will not be defined by perfection, but by the courage to stand up even when he feels profoundly unqualified to do so, carrying with him the memory of a mentor who died believing that the responsibility of Spider-Man was too heavy for a child, even as that very child becomes the only one left to carry it forward. The moment that alters Miles Morales' life forever does not arrive with ceremony or clarity. but with confusion, fear, and a profound sense of disorientation that mirrors his internal state long before he ever understands what has happened to him. Because the spider bite that grants him extraordinary abilities is not framed as destiny fulfilled, but as intrusion, an accident that crashes violently into a life already struggling to find balance. And it is precisely this lack of preparation, this absence of heroic intention, that defines Miles' transformation into Spider-Man as something deeply human rather than mythic. The bite occurs in the abandoned subway tunnel where Miles and his uncle Aaron have gone to paint graffiti, a space that has always represented freedom and authenticity for Miles, and the intrusion of the radioactive spider into this environment feels symbolic, as though the one place where he felt fully himself is now contaminated by forces beyond his control, turning a sanctuary into the site of irreversible change. The spider itself, marked with the number 42, is not immediately understood by Miles as anything significant, and when it bites him, the moment passes quickly, almost dismissively, a sharp pain followed by confusion, a detail that underscores how unceremonious the birth of a hero truly is, because Miles does not receive a calling or a vision, only an inexplicable disruption to his body and mind. In the hours and days that follow, Miles begins to experience changes that he cannot explain. His senses sharpen, his strength increases, and his body responds to stimuli in ways that defy logic. Yet these developments are not exhilarating but terrifying, because they arrive without instruction, context, or purpose, leaving Miles to confront the unsettling realization that something inside him is no longer behaving according to the rules he has always known. His first manifestation of spider-like abilities occurs not in a moment of triumph, but in embarrassment and panic, when he discovers that his hands and feet are sticking uncontrollably to surfaces, trapping him in humiliating situations that reflect his lack of agency over his own body. And these moments are played not for spectacle, but for vulnerability, emphasizing that power without understanding is not empowering but destabilizing. Miles's invisibility ability, which activates in moments of intense fear or stress, further reinforces this idea, because it is not a power he chooses to use, but a response his body makes to escape, to disappear, to avoid confrontation. A perfect metaphor for his pre-existing instinct to withdraw when overwhelmed, suggesting that his powers are not separate from his personality, but an extension of it. As Miles struggles to comprehend what is happening to him, he also experiences a heightened emotional sensitivity, a sense that the world is louder, sharper, and more demanding than before, and this sensory overload mirrors the pressure he already feels from school, family, and expectations, amplifying his anxiety rather than resolving it. Crucially, Miles does not initially associate these changes with Spider-Man because Spider-Man is, at this point, an external symbol, a public figure admired by the city but distrusted by his father, someone larger than life and fundamentally separate from Miles' private struggles. And the idea that he could be connected to that symbol feels absurd, almost insulting given how unprepared and unworthy he feels. When Miles returns to the subway tunnel and encounters the original Spider-Man during a battle with Kingpin's forces, the realization that his powers align with those of the city's hero hits him not as inspiration but as dread, because it confirms that the changes he is experiencing are not temporary or accidental, but part of something much larger and far more dangerous than he can handle. His interaction with Peter Parker in this moment is brief, chaotic, and traumatic, marked by confusion and fear rather than mentorship, as Miles is immediately confronted with the reality that Spider-Man's world is one of violence, sacrifice, and constant risk, a world he never asked to enter and does not feel capable of surviving. The bite, therefore, becomes less about gaining abilities and more about losing innocence, because from this point forward, Miles can no longer pretend that he is merely an observer in a world shaped by heroes and villains, as he has been forcibly drafted into a conflict that operates on a scale he cannot yet comprehend. Psychologically, the bite triggers a crisis of identity, because Miles now carries within him a power that demands action, even as his instincts tell him to hide, to run, to remain invisible, creating an internal conflict that defines his early journey as Spider-Man, a conflict between responsibility and self-preservation that feels deeply relatable rather than fantastical. The physical changes he undergoes are accompanied by emotional withdrawal, as Miles becomes increasingly isolated, unable to explain his behavior to his parents or his teachers, and increasingly fearful that revealing the truth will not only expose him, but shatter the fragile stability of his family, particularly given his father's hostility towards Spider-Man as a symbol of chaos. This secrecy intensifies Miles' sense of alienation, reinforcing the idea that power separates rather than connects, and that becoming Spider-Man may require sacrificing the very relationships that once anchored him, a fear that weighs heavily on his mind even before he understands the full cost of heroism. Importantly, the film does not rush Miles' acceptance of his powers, allowing him time to struggle, fail, and doubt, emphasizing that becoming Spider-Man is not an immediate transformation, but a gradual, painful process of adaptation. And this pacing grounds the story in emotional realism rather than spectacle. The Bite does not grant Miles confidence, clarity, or purpose, but confusion, instability, and fear, and it is only later, through loss, mentorship, and choice, that these raw, unformed abilities begin to take shape as tools of heroism rather than sources of anxiety. In this way, the bite serves as a catalyst rather than a solution, initiating a journey that will force Miles to confront his deepest insecurities and redefine his understanding of responsibility, courage, and identity, not as abstract ideals but as lived experiences shaped by consequence. Long before Miles learns how to swing, fight, or save lives, he must first learn how to exist in a body that no longer obeys familiar rules. And this disorienting, deeply personal struggle transforms the spider bite from a trope into a powerful metaphor for adolescence itself, a sudden and irreversible change that demands growth without providing guidance, leaving Miles to navigate uncertainty armed only with his values, his relationships, and the fragile hope that he might eventually become something more than he is now. As Miles Morales struggles to process the death of Peter Parker and the terrifying responsibility that now hangs over him, the emotional foundations of his life fracture even further when the conflict between heroism and family becomes painfully personal, transforming his journey from a story about inherited power into one about identity, loyalty, and irreversible loss. Because the revelation of his uncle Aaron as the Prowler does not merely introduce a new antagonist, but dismantles one of the few emotional safe spaces Miles has ever known. Uncle Aaron has always represented freedom, creativity, and unconditional acceptance in Miles' life, someone who listened without judgment and encouraged expression rather than conformity. And this bond makes the truth about Aaron's secret life devastating, not only because it reveals deception, but because it forces Miles to confront the uncomfortable reality that the person who understood him best has been living in moral contradiction to everything Spider-Man represents. The moment Miles discovers Aaron's identity as the Prowler is not framed as a dramatic villain reveal, but as an intimate betrayal, unfolding in silence and shock, as Miles realizes that the man who guided him through art and self-discovery is also hired enforcer for Kingpin, someone who profits from violence and chaos, and this collision of identities destabilizes Miles's understanding of right and wrong at a time when he is already emotionally overwhelmed. Aaron's reaction to discovering that Miles is Spider-Man adds another layer of complexity, because rather than responding with anger or exploitation, he is horrified, suddenly confronted with the realization that the boy he has been protecting is now in mortal danger, and this moment exposes the humanity beneath Aaron's criminal persona, revealing a man trapped between love and livelihood, conscience and survival. The conversation between Miles and Aaron in the apartment hallway becomes one of the most emotionally charged moments in Miles's story, not because of action or spectacle, but because it crystallizes the impossible position Miles now occupies, forced to choose between family loyalty and moral responsibility, between protecting someone he loves and standing against what that person represents. Aaron's attempt to reconcile these conflicting roles is short-lived, as Kingpin's ruthlessness allows no room for hesitation, And when Aaron refuses to kill Spider-Man after realizing it is Miles, his punishment is immediate and fatal, turning a moment of potential redemption into a tragedy that permanently alters Miles' emotional landscape. Aaron's death is not heroic or grand, but abrupt and senseless, underscoring the cruelty of the world Miles has been pulled into and reinforcing the idea that moral choices often come with unbearable consequences, especially when made within systems that value obedience over humanity. For Miles, witnessing his uncle's death is a breaking point because it confirms his deepest fear that becoming Spider-Man will inevitably destroy the people he loves, transforming responsibility into something that feels indistinguishable from curse. The aftermath of Aaron's death deepens the rift between Miles and his father, as Jefferson Davis mourns his brother-in-law without knowing the full truth, while Miles is forced to carry the weight of a secret that isolates him completely, unable to grieve openly or explain the complexity of his pain. And this silence becomes emotionally suffocating, intensifying his sense of alienation at home. Jefferson's grief is compounded by his growing distrust of Spider-Man, whom he now subconsciously associates with the violence that has touched his family. And this dynamic places Miles in an impossible emotional position, loving his father while embodying the very symbol his father now resents even more deeply. Rio Morales attempts to hold the family together, offering comfort without answers, but even her empathy cannot bridge the gap created by secrets, and Miles's inability to confide in her further reinforces the isolation that defines his early experience as a hero. The loss of Aaron forces Miles to re-evaluate the simplistic binary between hero and villain, revealing a world where people can be loving mentors and violent criminals at the same time, and this moral ambiguity becomes central to Miles's understanding of justice, shaping his approach to heroism as something rooted in empathy rather than absolutism. Aaron's influence does not disappear with his death, but lingers in Miles' memory, both as a source of pain and as a reminder that people are more than their worst actions, a lesson that later informs Miles' refusal to accept rigid definitions of destiny or canon. Emotionally, Aaron's death strips Miles of the last illusion that he can compartmentalize his life, because the consequences of Spider-Man's world have now invaded his family irreversibly, making retreat impossible and forcing him to confront the cost of inaction as well as action. This tragedy also marks the moment when Miles's identity crisis shifts from internal uncertainty to moral resolve, as grief begins to harden into determination. Not because Miles suddenly feels ready, but because he understands that refusing to act will not protect anyone, and that fear cannot be allowed to dictate his choices. The revelation of the Prowler and the loss that follows transform Miles's journey from reluctant inheritance into personal commitment, anchoring his decision to become Spider-Man, not in admiration or destiny, but in the painful knowledge that the world is already dangerous, and that choosing to stand aside will not prevent suffering. In losing his uncle, Miles loses a part of his childhood, but he gains a deeper, more painful understanding of the complexity of humanity, an understanding that becomes essential as he moves closer to fully embracing the mask, not as a symbol of perfection, but as a promise to act with compassion in a world that rarely offers clear moral answers, carrying forward both the love and the loss that have shaped him into something more than a successor, something uniquely his own. In the aftermath of loss and disillusionment, Miles Morales reaches the most critical crossroads of his journey, a point where grief, fear, and responsibility converge, forcing him to decide not whether he is ready to be Spider-Man, but whether he is willing to try despite knowing he may fail, because the defining moment of his transformation is not marked by mastery of power or triumph over fear, but by acceptance of uncertainty as an unavoidable part of becoming something greater than oneself. After witnessing the death of his uncle and carrying the guilt of Peter Parker's sacrifice, Miles retreats inward, overwhelmed by the belief that he does not measure up to the legacy placed upon him, and this emotional paralysis manifests physically when he is unable to control his powers, particularly his inability to stick to surfaces at will, symbolizing his lack of grounding and self-trust. This period of doubt is crucial because it demonstrates that heroism in Miles' story is not about confidence preceding action, but about action creating confidence, a reversal of traditional heroic narratives that placed certainty before commitment. The intervention of Peter B. Parker and the other Spider People becomes significant not as a source of technical training, but as a mirror reflecting the many imperfect paths that lead to heroism, each of them flawed, broken, and deeply human in their own ways. And through their presence, Miles begins to understand that Spider-Man is not defined by singular excellence, but by persistence in the face of inadequacy. Peter B. Parker's mentorship, in particular, reframes the legacy of Spider-Man not as an unreachable ideal embodied by the fallen Peter Parker, but as a role continuously reshaped by failure, resilience, and choice, allowing Miles to see that even the most experienced Spider-Men struggle with doubt and regret, and that these struggles do not disqualify them from heroism. The emotional breakthrough comes not through instruction, but through conversation, especially the moment when Peter B. Parker admits that there is no moment of readiness, no instant where fear disappears and certainty arrives, only a leap of faith that must be taken without guarantee of success. And this idea resonates deeply with Miles, reframing his fear not as evidence of weakness, but as a shared condition of every Spider-Man who has ever existed. Miles' decision to embrace the role of Spider-Man is solidified in the aftermath of a painful confrontation with his father, who unknowingly speaks directly to the heart of Miles' struggle when he tells his son that he does not need to be perfect, that he only needs to be himself, and that he believes in him regardless of outcome. Words that pierce through Miles' self-doubt and provide the emotional permission he needs to move forward. This moment is transformative because it allows Miles to internalize a version of responsibility that is rooted in authenticity rather than expectation, freeing him from the impossible burden of replacing Peter Parker and enabling him to become his own Spider-Man instead. The act of creating his suit becomes a powerful symbol of this self-definition, as Miles intentionally incorporates elements of his own identity into the costume, painting over the traditional Spider-Man suit with colors and symbols drawn from his graffiti art, reclaiming the image of Spider-Man as something personal rather than inherited. And in doing so, he visually and emotionally asserts that his heroism will not be an imitation, but an evolution. The leap of faith itself, when Miles steps off the skyscraper and finally trusts his body, his instincts, and his choice, represents the culmination of his internal journey, not because it demonstrates technical mastery, but because it signifies surrender to possibility, an acceptance that fear will always exist, but that it does not have to dictate action. Visually and emotionally, this moment crystallizes the central theme of Miles' story, that becoming Spider-Man is not about achieving certainty, but about embracing vulnerability and choosing to act anyway. A lesson that echoes far beyond the confines of superhero mythology. Once Miles commits, his powers begin to respond not to control but to confidence, suggesting that belief itself is a crucial component of his abilities, and this alignment between internal state and external action underscores the deeply personal nature of his heroism. In the climactic confrontation with Kingpin, Miles does not defeat his enemy through superior strength or experience, but through adaptability, empathy, and the willingness to stand his ground despite overwhelming odds, embodying a version of Spider-Man that is defined not by dominance but by resilience. Kingpin's defeat marks the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, as Miles proves not that he is the best Spider-Man, but that he is capable of bearing the responsibility, a distinction that preserves his humanity while validating his choice. In the aftermath, as the multiverse stabilizes and the other Spider People return to their worlds, Miles is left alone to carry the mantle forward, no longer as a reluctant heir, but as an active guardian of his city, shaped by loss but strengthened by choice. This transformation is not framed as completion, but as initiation, because becoming Spider-Man is not a destination, but a continuous process of growth, failure, and recommitment. And Miles' story makes clear that heroism is not inherited through blood or destiny, but forged through self-belief, empathy, and the courage to leap into the unknown even when the ground below cannot yet be seen. With the collider destroyed and the multiverse temporarily stabilized, Miles Morales emerges from the chaos, not as a visitor to Spider-Man's world, but as its sole guardian within his reality, a transition that is quieter than the battles that preceded it, yet far more complex, because the true challenge of becoming Spider-Man does not end with victory, but begins in the aftermath, when the noise fades and responsibility settles into daily life, demanding consistency rather than heroics. Miles now occupies a liminal space between two identities, expected to resume the life of an ordinary teenager while secretly carrying the weight of a role that never truly rests. And this tension defines his post into the Spider-Verse existence, as he learns that heroism is not measured only in moments of crisis, but in the ability to endure routine sacrifice without recognition. Returning to Brooklyn Vision's academy, Miles appears outwardly more confident, more assured, yet this confidence masks an ongoing internal negotiation, because the clarity he found in choosing to become Spider-Man does not erase doubt, but reframes it as something to be managed rather than avoided, and this shift marks a significant evolution in his character, as fear becomes a companion rather than an obstacle. At home, the dynamics within the Morales family subtly change, particularly in Miles's relationship with his father, Jefferson Davis, whose grief over Aaron's death and evolving perception of Spider-Man introduce a quiet irony into their interactions, as Jefferson begins to respect the hero his son has become without knowing that the respect is directed at Miles himself, creating moments of emotional intimacy layered with secrecy. Jefferson's speech to Spider-Man at Aaron's grave, in which he acknowledges his earlier hostility and admits that the city needs someone willing to stand between danger and the innocent, becomes one of the most emotionally significant moments in Miles's journey because it validates the role Miles has chosen while simultaneously reinforcing the cost of concealment, reminding him that being Spider-Man often means being unseen even by those who love you most. Rio Morales continues to act as Miles's emotional anchor, sensing his growth and pain without demanding explanation, offering trust rather than interrogation, and her quiet support reinforces the idea that heroism does not exist in isolation, but is sustained by relationships that allow space for complexity and silence. As Miles adapts to life as the only Spider-Man in his universe, he also begins to feel the absence of the Spider people who guided him through his initiation, particularly Gwen Stacy, whose presence lingers as both inspiration and unresolved longing, representing a connection to a wider reality that Miles can no longer access. And this absence introduces a new emotional dimension to his story, one defined by solitude rather than uncertainty. Miles's growth during this period is not marked by escalating spectacle but by restraint, as he learns to prioritize, to choose which battles to fight, and to accept that he cannot save everyone, a lesson that deepens his understanding of responsibility while preserving his empathy. This phase of his journey also reinforces the uniqueness of his powers, particularly his camouflage and venom abilities, which he begins to integrate more intuitively into his crime-fighting style, not as tools of dominance but as extensions of his adaptive, creative approach to problem solving, reflecting the way he navigates life itself, by finding unconventional paths through pressure rather than confronting it head on. Despite this progress, Miles remains emotionally unfinished, haunted by unresolved questions about destiny, loss, and the nature of the multiverse. Questions that resurface whenever he encounters anomalies or moments that hint at a larger reality beyond his control, suggesting that his story, though stabilized, is far from complete. The psychological cost of being Spider-Man becomes more apparent during this time, as Miles must learn to compartmentalize fear, grief, and responsibility without allowing them to consume his sense of self, a balancing act that requires constant adjustment and self-awareness. It is in this quieter chapter of Miles's life that the foundation is laid go for the conflicts of Across the Spider-Verse, because his experience as a solitary Spider-Man fosters both confidence and isolation, preparing him to challenge external authority while leaving him vulnerable to emotional fractures when that isolation is finally broken. The idea of belonging becomes increasingly complex for Miles, as he belongs fully to neither the ordinary world nor the heroic one, occupying instead a threshold space where identity is continually negotiated rather than resolved. And this in-betweenness becomes one of his defining strengths, as well as one of his deepest sources of tension. When Gwen Stacy eventually reappears, it is not merely a reunion, but a disruption, reopening questions Miles has learned to live with rather than answer, and signaling that the stability he has built is temporary, subject to forces that operate beyond his understanding and control. This period between worlds, between films, between phases of identity, is essential to understanding Miles not as a static hero, but as a living, evolving individual, because it demonstrates that becoming Spider-Man is not a single transformative event, but an ongoing process of integration, negotiation, and renewal, one that demands emotional resilience as much as physical courage. By the time the multiverse calls to him again, Miles Morales is no longer the frightened boy who could not control his powers, nor is he a finished hero secure in his role, but something far more compelling, a young man who has chosen responsibility, learned from loss, and embraced uncertainty, standing ready to question not only how to be Spider-Man, but what Spider-Man is truly meant to be. When Miles Morales is drawn back into the multiverse, the world that opens before him is far larger, more structured, and more ideologically rigid than anything he has previously encountered, because the Spider Society is not merely a gathering of heroes, but an institution built on rules, hierarchy, and an uncompromising interpretation of destiny. And Miles' encounter with it marks a fundamental shift in his story from personal growth to philosophical conflict. Unlike his first exposure to the multiverse, which was chaotic, improvised, and emotionally driven, the Spider Society presents itself as orderly and efficient, operating from the sprawling headquarters in Nueva York, a city that visually embodies the fusion of countless realities into a single, controlled system, suggesting from the outset that this version of multiversal cooperation prioritizes stability over individuality. At the center of this system stands Miguel O'Hara, Spider-Man 2099, whose authority derives not only from his strength and intelligence, but from his lived trauma, as he frames the Spider Society's mission as a response to catastrophic failures caused by emotional decision-making, positioning control as the only viable defense against multiversal collapse. Miguel introduces Miles to the concept of canon events, moments of loss and tragedy that, according to the Society's understanding, must occur in every Spider-Man's life to preserve the integrity of reality, such as the death of a police captain close to Spider-Man. And this revelation reframes Miles' entire journey within a deterministic framework that treats suffering not as consequence or chance, but as necessity. For Miles, this idea is immediately unsettling, because it reduces lived experience to predetermined checkpoints and reframes heroism as compliance with cosmic rules rather than moral choice, challenging the very foundation of the values he has developed through loss and self-definition. The Spider Society's enforcement mechanisms further reinforce this philosophy, as Spider people are monitored, tracked, and restrained if they deviate from prescribed outcomes, revealing an institutional fear of deviation that contrasts sharply with the individuality traditionally associated with Spider-Man across realities. Miles' status within the society is precarious from the beginning, not only because of his youth, but because he is labeled an anomaly. A Spider-Man who was never meant to exist, bitten by a spider from another universe, and therefore perceived as a disruption to the natural order rather than a legitimate successor, a judgment that undermines his hard-won sense of belonging. This classification wounds Miles deeply because it reframes his entire journey as a mistake rather than a choice, stripping meaning from the sacrifices he has made and threatening to reduce his identity to an error in a system he did not choose to enter. The Society's treatment of Miles reveals a central contradiction in its ideology, as it celebrates the diversity of spider people in appearance and background while enforcing ideological conformity, suggesting that difference is acceptable only when it does not challenge the underlying structure of control. Miles's discomfort grows as he witnesses the Society's willingness to allow suffering in the name of order, a stance that conflicts directly with the lesson he learned through Peter Parker's death and his uncle's loss. That responsibility is defined by the willingness to act to prevent harm, even when the outcome is uncertain. The tension between Miles and Miguel escalates when Miles learns that his father, Jefferson Davis, is destined to die as part of a canon event, transforming an abstract philosophy into an immediate, personal threat that forces Miles to confront the limits of obedience and the cost of acceptance. Miguel's insistence that intervention would endanger the multiverse positions him as a tragic enforcer rather than a villain, someone who has chosen to sacrifice compassion for stability. And this moral complexity prevents the conflict from becoming simplistic, instead framing it as a collision between two interpretations of responsibility. For Miles, the Spider Society becomes a mirror of every authority figure that has ever tried to define him without understanding him, from institutional education to multiversal governance, reinforcing his instinct to question systems that prioritize order over empathy. The chase that follows Miles' refusal to accept the canon framework is not merely an action sequence, but a symbolic rejection of imposed destiny. As Miles uses his unique powers and creativity and adaptability to evade hundreds of spider people, demonstrating that individuality itself can be a form of resistance. This escape cements Miles' role as a disruptor within the multiverse, not because he seeks chaos, but because he refuses to accept a version of heroism that demands passive complicity in preventable tragedy. The Spider Society's response to Miles' defiance exposes the fragility of its order, as control requires constant enforcement, and dissent reveals the limits of ideological consensus, suggesting that stability built on suppression is inherently unstable. By rejecting the Society's interpretation of canon, Miles does not deny the reality of loss, but he rejects the idea that suffering must be preserved to maintain meaning, asserting instead that heroism lies in the continual attempt to save others, even when success is not guaranteed. This chapter marks a turning point in Miles' story because it elevates his conflict from personal insecurity to ethical defiance, positioning him not just as a Spider-Man navigating destiny, but as a moral agent willing to challenge the very foundations of multiversal order. The Spider Society, for all its power and unity, cannot accommodate a Spider-Man who believes that responsibility includes the right to question fate itself. And, in choosing to run rather than submit, Miles affirms that his identity was never defined by canon or accident, but by choice, empathy, and the refusal to accept a world where love must be sacrificed for the illusion of control. As Miles Morales pushes back against the rigid determinism of the Spider Society, the emotional cost of his defiance crystallizes most painfully through his relationship with Gwen Stacy, because their bond, built on shared loss, mutual understanding, and quiet vulnerability, becomes the space where ideology turns into personal betrayal, transforming abstract disagreements about destiny into deeply human wounds. Gwen is not simply another spider person in Miles' story, but the first peer who truly understands what it means to carry the mask alone, someone who has navigated grief, isolation, and responsibility without the support structures Miles still possesses, and this shared emotional language creates a connection that transcends universes, grounding their relationship in empathy rather than romance alone. Their reunion in Across the Spider-Verse initially rekindles a sense of belonging for Miles, offering him a glimpse of a world where he is not isolated by secrecy or misunderstanding, and for a brief moment the multiverse feels less like a threat and more like a community, a place where difference is not only tolerated but celebrated. However, this sense of belonging is built on omission rather than honesty. As Gwen withholds critical information about the Spider Society, Miguel's ideology, and the fate that has been assigned to Miles's father, believing that shielding Miles from the truth will protect him, a decision rooted in fear rather than malice. Gwen's choice reflects her own trauma, shaped by the belief that deviation leads to catastrophe, and her loyalty to the Spider Society stems not from agreement, but from desperation, as she seeks structure in the aftermath of being rejected by her own father and isolated within her universe. For Miles, the eventual revelation that Gwen knew about the canon events and said nothing is devastating because it reframes their entire interaction as conditional, undermining the trust that allowed him to feel seen and understood. And this sense of exclusion cuts deeper than the society's rejection, because it comes from someone he believes stood beside him rather than above him. The emotional fallout of this betrayal highlights one of the central tensions of Miles's story, the difference between protection and control, because Gwen's silence, though intended to spare him pain, ultimately denies him agency, echoing the same paternalistic logic used by Miguel and the society to justify enforced suffering. Miles's reaction is not anger alone, but profound hurt, as he realizes that even those who care for him are willing to make decisions on his behalf without his consent, reinforcing the fear that his role in the multiverse is defined by other people's rules rather than his own moral compass. Gwen's internal conflict becomes increasingly apparent as she watches Miles flee the Spider Society, torn between loyalty to the institution that gave her purpose and the individual who represents everything Spider-Man is meant to protect. And this fracture exposes the emotional cost of obedience, revealing how adherence to rigid systems erodes trust and connection. The distance that grows between Miles and Gwen is not the result of opposing values, but of incompatible choices made under pressure, illustrating how good intentions can still produce harm when transparency is sacrificed for perceived stability. For Gwen, losing Miles's trust forces a reckoning with her own beliefs about responsibility, compelling her to confront the possibility that following rules is not synonymous with doing what is right, and that moral clarity cannot be outsourced to authority without consequence. For Miles, the rupture reinforces his conviction that heroism must be rooted in honesty and agency, even when the truth is painful, and that love, whether romantic or platonic, cannot justify the denial of another person's right to choose their path. The emotional weight of this separation lingers throughout the narrative, shaping Miles's resolve and Gwen's eventual rebellion, as both characters are forced to confront the limitations of their previous assumptions about safety, trust, and duty. The breakdown of their relationship serves as a microcosm of the larger ideological conflict within the multiverse, demonstrating how systems built on control inevitably fracture personal bonds, turning protection into isolation and loyalty into complicity. Despite the pain, this chapter does not reduce Gwen to an antagonist or Miles to a victim, instead presenting both as individuals navigating trauma in different ways, each constrained by fear and shaped by loss, and this nuance preserves the humanity at the core of their story. The emotional distance between them becomes a catalyst rather than a conclusion, setting the stage for growth, accountability, and eventual reconciliation, not through absolution, but through action. In losing Gwen's trust and companionship, Miles does not lose his compassion, but he gains clarity, understanding that connection without honesty is fragile, and that true partnership requires shared risk rather than managed outcomes. This painful lesson strengthens his resolve to act independently, not out of bitterness, but out of the belief that responsibility includes respecting others enough to tell them the truth, even when doing so invites chaos. The chapter closes with Miles moving forward alone once again, carrying the ache of exclusion, but also the certainty that his path, though lonely, is guided by empathy rather than control, and that any future reconciliation must be built not on silence or fear, but on the courage to choose honesty over comfort in a universe that constantly demands obedience. Stranded in Earth 42, Miles Morales is finally forced to confront the most unsettling question of his journey, not whether he deserves to be Spider-Man, but whether Spider-Man can exist without the moral foundations that once defined him, because this universe stands as a living counterfactual to everything he has fought for, a reality shaped not by canon events fulfilled, but by their absence, revealing the true cost of a world where the symbol of Spider-Man never emerged. Brooklyn in Earth 42 is familiar in geography, but alien in spirit, darker, harsher, and ruled by criminal power rather than protected by community. And this contrast immediately communicates that heroism is not an abstract role, but a stabilizing force whose absence reshapes everyday life, turning streets into battlegrounds and families into survivors rather than citizens. As Miles navigates this distorted reflection of home, the weight of responsibility deepens because he is confronted with evidence that choices, ripple outward far beyond intention, and that while destiny should never be blindly obeyed, its disruption leaves wounds that cannot be ignored. The most devastating revelation comes when Miles encounters his counterpart, Miles G. Morales, a version of himself shaped by loss, scarcity, and a world that never offered him the chance to become Spider-Man, a young man who has grown into the role of the Prowler, not out of malice but necessity, embodying what Miles might have become if guidance, community, and hope had been systematically stripped away. This encounter fractures Miles's understanding of identity because it reveals that character is not fixed but forged by environment and opportunity, challenging any simplistic notion that heroism is innate or inevitable, and reinforcing the idea that becoming Spider-Man is less about power than about the values that guide its use. Seeing his alternate self forces Miles to confront his own privilege, not in material terms but in emotional and moral support, the presence of parents who loved him, mentors who believed in him, and a community that, despite its flaws, never abandoned him. And this recognition deepens his empathy rather than diminishing his resolve. Earth 42's Miles is not a villain in the traditional sense, but a survivor, someone who adapted to a broken system rather than challenged it. And this moral ambiguity complicates Miles's understanding of justice, reminding him that condemnation without conta is itself a form of cruelty. Trapped, restrained, and outnumbered once again, Miles faces a version of captivity unlike any he has known, not imposed by an institution claiming moral authority, but by a world that reflects the consequences of systemic failure, forcing him to confront the uncomfortable truth that even righteous defiance can produce unintended harm. Yet rather than breaking him, this realization clarifies his purpose, because Miles understands that his role is not to preserve canon, nor to reject it blindly, but to act as a moral constant in a multiverse defined by instability, someone willing to accept responsibility for both action and consequence. The parallel journeys of Miles and Gwen Stacy unfold simultaneously, as Gwen's rebellion against the Spider Society and her decision to gather allies represent the beginning of a new ethical framework within the multiverse, one that values choice, transparency, and collective accountability over rigid obedience. And although Miles is unaware of her actions, the emotional groundwork laid by their conflict makes this movement possible. Alone in Earth 42, Miles reaches the most mature articulation of his identity, understanding that Spider-Man is not a role assigned by fate nor revoked by authority, but a commitment renewed through choice, empathy, and courage, even when the outcome is uncertain or the cost unbearable. The absence of a clear resolution at the end of Across the Spider-Verse is not a narrative failure, but a deliberate affirmation of this philosophy, leaving Miles suspended between danger and possibility, not as a victim of fate, but as an agent of change whose story resists closure, because growth itself cannot be finalized. This open ending reinforces the central truth of Miles Morales' journey, that heroism is not validated by prophecy, canon, or institutional approval, but by the refusal to surrender compassion in the face of fear, and by the willingness to stand alone if necessary to protect what matters. Earth 42 becomes both a warning and a proving ground, a reminder of what happens when systems fail and individuals are left without hope, and a challenge to Miles to imagine a future that does not repeat the mistakes of either blind obedience or reckless disruption. As the chapter closes, Miles Morales stands at the intersection of infinite possibilities, defined not by the spider that bit him, nor by the universes that reject him, but by the choices he continues to make, embodying a Spider-Man whose greatest power is not strength, speed, or invisibility, but the courage to believe that even in a multiverse governed by a loss, the future is still unwritten and worth fighting for. Miles Morales' refusal to accept the logic of canon events sets in motion a chain of consequences that strip away any remaining illusion of safety or neutrality within the multiverse, because once he is labeled not just an anomaly but a threat, the conflict surrounding him shifts from ideological disagreement to active containment, transforming his journey into a desperate struggle to preserve agency in a system that views deviation as catastrophe. The Spider Society's pursuit of Miles is relentless and impersonal, revealing how institutions built on control, respond when challenged not by dialogue or compromise, but by escalation. And this response exposes the underlying fear that drives Miguel O'Hara's leadership, the fear that one act of defiance could unravel the fragile order holding countless universes together. Miles's capture is not framed as a failure of ability, but as a consequence of isolation, as he is overwhelmed by sheer numbers and technological restraints. Rather than outmatched in skill, reinforcing the idea that power structures rarely fall, because they are right, but because they are massive and coordinated. Restrained within the society's headquarters, Miles is confronted directly with the narrative imposed upon him, told that his existence is a mistake, that the spider bite that gave him powers never belonged to his world, and that his very identity is the product of a cosmic error. A declaration that threatens to erase the meaning of every choice he has made since becoming Spider Man. This attempt to redefine Miles's life as an accident rather than a journey is one of the most psychologically violent acts he endures, because it reframes resilience as disruption and compassion as recklessness, demanding that he see himself not as a protector but as a liability. Miguel's explanation of his own past, including the loss of a universe he tried to replace through emotional intervention, adds tragic context to his rigidity, revealing a leader shaped by catastrophic failure who now equates control with survival. Yet this vulnerability does not soften the weight of his judgment, instead highlighting the danger of trauma calcified into doctrine. For Miles, hearing Miguel's story does not inspire obedience, but reinforces his conviction that fear-driven systems inevitably sacrifice individuals in the name of abstract stability, a lesson he has already learned through personal loss and family tragedy. The revelation that his father's impending death is considered a necessary canon event pushes Miles past the threshold of compromise, transforming philosophical disagreement into moral emergency, because the cost of compliance is no longer theoretical, but personal and immediate. Miles' response to this revelation is not denial, but defiance, as he refuses to accept a universe where love is subordinate to protocol, asserting that responsibility without compassion is indistinguishable from cruelty. His escape from captivity is not merely an act of physical resistance, but a symbolic reclamation of identity, as he uses his unique powers, particularly his invisibility and venom abilities, to break free from restraints designed for standardized spider people, demonstrating that his difference, once labeled as error, is in fact his greatest strength. The pursuit that follows, stretching across the society's vast headquarters, becomes a visual and thematic expression of Miles's rejection of imposed destiny as he navigates environments not built for him, outthinking and outmaneuvering opponents who rely on conformity and prediction. When Miles finally escapes through a dimensional portal, believing he is returning home to save his father, the moment is charged with urgency and hope because it represents the possibility that choice can still alter outcome, that love can still intervene in fate. However, this hope is undercut by a devastating miscalculation, as Miles is sent not to his own universe, but to Earth 42, the world from which the spider that bit him originated, a mistake that recontextualizes everything he has fought for and exposes the fragility of even his most determined plans. Arriving in a Brooklyn that feels familiar yet profoundly wrong, Miles is confronted with the unsettling realization that universes shaped by absence and divergence can produce entirely different outcomes, and this realization forces him to confront the unintended consequences of disruption, not as punishment, but as reality. The absence of Spider-Man in Earth 42 reveals a city hardened by neglect, where crime has filled the vacuum left by heroism, challenging Miles to confront the uncomfortable truth that while destiny should not be worshipped, its disruption carries real cost. This moment does not invalidate Miles's choices but complicates them, introducing nuance into his moral framework and reinforcing that agency requires accountability as well as courage. The capture and escape sequence thus collapses any remaining certainty in Miles's understanding of the multiverse, stripping away the false binary between obedience and chaos, and replacing it with a far more demanding reality, where every choice reshapes worlds in unpredictable ways. Isolated once again, stranded in the wrong universe, and pursued by forces that see him as a threat, Miles is forced to rely not on allies or institutions, but on the core values that have guided him from the beginning: empathy, resilience, and the refusal to surrender his humanity to fear. This chapter marks the point at which Miles's story becomes truly singular, as he moves beyond the question of whether he belongs among Spider-Men and begins to confront a far more daunting challenge: how to remain himself in a multiverse, determined to define him as an error, carrying forward the belief that even in a system built on inevitability, choice still matters, even when its consequences cannot be fully controlled.